Yes, our speaker today is Tesa Madsen-McQueen, and she grew up in the Missouri Ozark, and she fell in love with native plants right away. She received her bachelor from Missouri State University in 2015 and a master degree in ecology and evolution from the Appalachian State University in 2018, where she started being interested in species distribution modeling, phylogeography, and community phylogenetics. In 2018, she started her PhD at UCR with Dr. Marcus Pacievic in the evolution, ecology, and organismal biology department with the focus on plant community assembly and biogeography in relation to climate change. Our talk today is about tracing the fingerprint of climate change, 40 years of vegetation response across a steep elevation gradient in Southern California. So Tessa.
All right, sorry. Thank you, Andrea. It's great to meet all of you and to hear about all the work you're doing, which often the Ivory Tower can be very insular. So I'd like to make a special effort to potentially make it to more of your guys' meetings and just keep better track of what's going on the ground. So yes, I'm in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at UCR. And today I'm sharing the results of my first chapter of my dissertation. So this image, or a version of this image, probably looks pretty familiar to all of you, whether you witnessed it in person, if you were in Southern California, or on national news. This apocalyptic kind of scene is pretty scary on its own, but especially scary when we consider that this year's record-breaking fire season is the consequence of a much larger crisis, and one that's just recently unfolding in a more assertive way that's starting to grab the attention of the general public through the increasing prevalence of these extreme weather events. So in early September 2020, an intense heat wave broke temperature records in several different locations in Southern California. So the darkest red areas on this map show where temperatures were surpassing 113 degrees Fahrenheit. And these hot, dry conditions helped fuel new and existing fires, which have consumed tens of thousands of acres of land. So heat waves in Southern California, I probably don't need to tell you guys, but they're occurring earlier and they're persisting later in the year, which is resulting in overall a longer heat wave season, which has serious consequences for the fire season in Southern California. And these longer and more intense heat waves fit with long-term projections that Southern California is expected to see a dramatic increase in these extremely dry seasons, increasing by over 140% in frequency after 2050. So that's more than doubling in frequency. And simultaneously, a much higher frequency in these extremely wet seasons, which will lead to over 100% increase or doubling in these extreme dry to wet, what's been called precipitation whiplash events. So similar to what California witnessed with the multi-year intense drought that began in 2012, and that ended with the intense flooding of 2016 to 2017. And alarmingly, these projections are situated in the foreground of a larger pattern of rapid global temperature warming. And I always think that it's helpful to look at things on a geologic time scale. And this figure is the result of recent isotope reconstructions of the Earth's climate dating back 67 million years. And you can see that we've switched from a generally warm house climate when average surface temperatures were about 5 degrees Celsius warmer than today, on average, to a longer cool house climate. And looking at the Ipcc projections for the business as usual scenario shows that before 2150, we're on track to witness global temperatures the planet hasn't seen in over 34 million years, which feels pretty terrifying to imagine. So in considering the rapidity of anthropogenic climate forcing, a very important question, and one that our lives and subsistence depend on, one that all of you care about, is how biodiversity will respond. So animals needing to migrate to more suitable conditions will likely face major barriers related to increasing habitat loss and fragmentation, which you all were just getting at here in Western Riverside County. And these challenges are dramatically compounded for sessile organisms like plants that cannot easily move to more optimal conditions. So plants in any given ecosystem that experience changes in their climatic condition will either face extinction by not being suited for survival in the new conditions, or they might persist either through high tolerance capacity or by undergoing adaptations, or they will migrate to track more optimal conditions for their biology. So shifts in species distributions are the most widely documented response to past climate change from paleoecological data, and it's expected to be the most widely observed biological response to climate change in the future. But since plants face the unique challenges of being sessile, their mode of response is much more difficult to predict. And importantly, species are comprised of populations that make up their geographic range. And so these populations will likely respond in heterogeneous ways. And these varied responses among different populations throughout a species range will ultimately be determined by both intrinsic factors, such as their demographic rates and colonization ability, as well as extrinsic factors, such as their interactions with other co-occurring species, such as mutualists or competitors, or by the velocity of climate change that they experience, which refers to the rate that they would have to move to track their optimum. And empirical efforts in documenting recent elevational range shifts have predominantly focused on species leading edges or on the center or optimum of their range, and have assumed that there would be this uniform upward shift in response to what's presumably linear and uniform environmental change that's consistent with warming temperatures. And while this probably seems to you all very simplified, consistent with this simplified expectation, there has been a general trend in upward shifts, not only in elevation, but also in latitude. And most of these studies come from temperate alpine ecosystems. But recent work is documenting that there are increasing idiosyncratic responses, both in the rate that species are moving, as well as in the direction. So some species are not responding at all from long-term data, and some species are even showing, an increasing number are showing downward elevational shifts. So more realistically, species will exhibit a wider diversity of responses to climate change, which will depend on, for plants, on their persistence rate, once conditions become unfavorable, as well as in their movement rate, which will result in these different patterns that are determined by changes in not only their range edges, but also changes in their abundance. So for instance, if a species at the bottom left of this figure has a low persistence rate and a low rate of movement, then they will eventually face extinction. If a species has a high rate of persistence, is able to tolerate conditions that are changing, but they're not able to migrate, they may just experience a decrease in abundance throughout their range, along with potentially a range contraction and possibly facing eventual extinction. The other dynamics will depend on whether species colonization and establishment events occur within or outside of their current range, and also how their trailing edge will respond, which has received a lot less attention in range shift studies. And this complex mosaic of responses really throws a wrench in what has been developed in range limit theory, forcing us to contend with nature's complexity, which is fun. So range limit theory often invokes this pretty cartoonish, linear, unidimensional environmental variation across geographic space, in which the edge of a species' range in geographic space is their edge in climate space. So this assumes that species at the edge of their geographic range are outside of their climatic niche or at the edge of it more closely. However, real world landscapes are very complex. And especially in complex topography, environmental conditions can vary at very small spatial scale, such as among different aspects, so that geographic range edges and climatic niche edges do not always line up. So this means that species at the interior of their geographic range might be at a climatically stressful location and could show a decline in further complex and unpredictable ways. And in addition to the complexity of the environment, species responses and their rates of movement and persistence will ultimately be determined by their functional traits. So plant functional traits are attributes such as leaf and dispersal characteristics that influence some aspect of a plant's performance and ultimately their fitness under a given set of environmental conditions. So the functional traits of plant species provide a more mechanistic link to how they perceive their environment. So they could be helpful in explaining the wide diversity of species responses to climate change that we're witnessing and help give us some predictability. And as an ecological tool, plant functional traits have proven extremely useful in basically representing proxies for species strategies and helping us understand multiple levels of ecological organization. So processes at the level of individuals, such as their growth rate and drought tolerance, and at the community level, they've helped us understand how functional trait trade-offs among different interacting species mediate their ability to coexist. And so helping to refine our models of how plant communities assemble, as well as at the ecosystem level, how functional traits contribute to ecosystem functioning, such as influencing decomposition rates, carbon sequestration, and nutrient cycling, etc. And remarkably, 3/4 of trait variation among land plants across the planet is captured in this two-dimensional global spectrum of plant form and function. So one of these major dimensions within this plane reflects the size of whole plants and their parts. So on one end of the spectrum, we have small-seeded plant species that tend to be shorter, and on the other, we have large-seeded species that are often taller. The other major dimension of this spectrum represents the leaf economic spectrum, which balances leaf construction cost against their growth potential. So at one end of the spectrum, we have plants that have larger leaves that tend to have also higher nutrient content. And at the other end, smaller leaves with higher carbon and lower nutrient content. So this global spectrum is an incredible realization because it allows us to place any plant in the world on these axes and start to make some bigger generalizations about how plants are organized in responding to one another and responding to their environment. And while some range shift studies have started to incorporate functional traits, there's been a predominant focus on seed and dispersal characteristics, which makes sense, or broad life history categories, but without incorporating traits that relate to how plants use resources and acquire resources. So the leaf economic spectrum represents this single axis that I just showed you among leaves, and represents trait covariation between, on the one hand, slow species that are conservative with lower rates of photosynthesis, lower nutrient content, and an overall strategy that enables them to tolerate more long-term stressful conditions. So a good example is this Juniperus california. At the other end of the spectrum, species with fast leaves, with higher photosynthesis rates, growth rates, higher nutrient content, represented by like this cute little peridily that just germinates and grows really rapidly and has high rates of photosynthesis, et cetera, and then dies shortly after. And this spectrum explains the majority of among species variation in their leaf morphology and function. So recent work shows that leaf traits along this spectrum can also capture key trade-offs that plants have in maximizing carbon gain under different temperatures. So incorporating traits from the leaf economic spectrum can help us understand how anticipated climate change scenarios might change the suite of leaf thermal and photosynthetic traits that are ultimately favored at a given site. And not only are traits promising for making generalizations about how species might respond to climate change and their redistribution, but also how vegetation patterns will change at a large scale. And for instance, ecosystems dominated by species with this slow strategy will have higher carbon sequestration, lower nutrient availability, and just overall slower biogeochemical cycling. And if we get some kind of transition to an ecosystem with fast traits on this leaf economic spectrum, we tend to see the opposite pattern. It's also important that we look at the consequences of changing plant functional traits. So for instance, the boreal forest ecotone, there's feedback effects from the conifer species which maintain more acidic soil conditions, and it's preventing the expansion of deciduous species, expanding their ranges northward. So the research questions that I had in undertaking this study were, how have dominant species responded to these long-term changes throughout their elevational range distribution? So looking at the leading edge limits as well as just abundance changes throughout, and asking, are they primarily responding by shifting their limits, changing their abundance, or both? Just understanding on a more fine scale what's happening. And do interspecific differences in their traits help us explain variations in these range and abundance shifts? And Southern California is an ideal place to investigate these questions, with really complex topography and being situated at the convergence of multiple biogeographical zones, with distinct climatic regimes and high ecological turnover along elevation gradients. It's absolutely ideal. And Deep Canyon, which many of you are probably familiar with, is located between the Coachella Valley and the Santa Rosa Mountains. And it's particularly interesting because it lies at the crossroads of the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, though it's officially part of the Colorado Desert. The entire canyon spans an elevation gain of 2,400 meters over a distance of 16 kilometers, so it's very steep. And the highest point is at Toro Peak in the Santa Rosa Mountains. And along this gradient, it encompasses 9 distinctly described plant communities. So a large portion of the canyon is within Boyd Deep Canyon Research Station, which is a UC reserve many of you have probably heard of or visited. And it's important to note that these ecotone transitions haven't been included in a lot of long-term studies of range dynamics. But looking at these habitats, they often contain individuals that are already living at the extreme of their physiological tolerance. So making these zones more responsive to environmental disturbance and potentially more sensitive to climate change. So it's been predicted that these are the first areas we might start to see the consequences. So Deep Canyon is pretty ideal. And in the mid-1970s, a dedicated UC botanist working at the reserve named Jan Zabriskie, he established and surveyed 22 locations from the floor of the Coachella Valley to Toro Peak, spanning this entire gradient. And his transects were spaced at these 400-foot elevation intervals, because that's how topo maps were read then. And he established them to reflect the predominant biotic communities of each elevation. He documented over 600 plant species. And unfortunately, the 2 sites that were at the lowest elevations were not protected and were eventually developed and are now part of a golf course community, which is unfortunate. But in 2007 to 2008, Ann Kelly, in her master's thesis, decided to resurvey these transects. I still find it amazing that this was her master's thesis that was published in PNAS. But Anne and her advisor resurveyed Jan's transects, and they found substantial upslope shifts in the 10 most widely distributed species, with an average upslope shift of 65 meters. They found that plant cover declined by a median of 46% in the lower parts or the trailing edges of species ranges. So the study was a big deal because it was among the first to document this synchronous upslope leaning response of dominant species that span this contiguous gradient encompassing multiple habitats. So the vegetation surveys from 1977 to 2008 provided really valuable insight into these long-term responses of plants. And for the first couple chapters of my dissertation, I wanted to resurvey the whole gradient to see how plants have responded and to ask multiple questions, not just about range shifts, but more specifically to use it as a model system to ask fundamental questions about how trait-based community assembly works under rapidly changing abiotic conditions. So following the methods of the previous two surveys, each transect was revisited using GPS coordinates from 2008 that Anne recorded. And we basically just did the exact same thing. Anne came and visited and showed me exactly what she did, what Jan showed her. So we basically just stretch a 400-meter transect tape between these two endpoints following the ISO contours. And in addition to recording the perennial vegetation cover, which is what the 2008 survey recorded, I decided to also include all of the annual species. And 2019 was a very wet year, if you all probably remember, so there were lots of annuals. And so it ended up taking months to do, quite a long time, and with a four-person crew as well. And so each 400-meter transect equates to 40,000 centimeters, and this turns out to be about 84 football fields. So it is a lot of plant data and has taken a long time to clean and analyze. But in addition, we collected functional trait data. So we collected data on leaf area of dominant species, specific leaf area, which is the surface area per unit of dry biomass. We looked at chlorophyll content, water use efficiency using stable isotopes, as well as seed mass. So analyzing the climate data from the 6 nearest weather stations that were included in the 2008 paper, I found that surprisingly, precipitation variables have shown no significant changes between the surveys, but temperature variables did. So each elevation showed some significant increase in at least one temperature variable. So either mean annual temperature, monthly maximum, or monthly minimum temperature. And total perennial cover was surprisingly stable throughout most of the gradient, with some exceptions. So the lowermost transects, they showed substantial increases in cover, as you can see, which is the rocky slopes habitat. So it's consisted mostly of desert scrub species. And the uppermost transects showed decreases in cover on average. And these upper elevations are mixed conifer forests with Jeffrey pine and white fir, Calucedrus as well. And one of my favorites, Salvia pachyphylla. So here's the entire canyon from close to Toro Peak. I'll give you guys a minute to take in the view because it's pretty phenomenal. So for the range shifts, we found an average upward shift. I should say that this line is a 1-to-1 line. So everything above this line represents an upward shift, and everything below the line is a downward shift. So we found significant upward shifts in species leading edge range distributions. So we found an average upward shift of 116 meters, which is about 29 meters per decade. So this is on the higher end of what has been observed globally in terms of rates of upward movement. And a couple species driving this pattern that were at the higher end of shifting their range limits were Yucca shedidgera, shifted upward quite substantially, and Pinus monophylla. So these were two that shifted pretty dramatically upward. And surprisingly, we found an average downward shift of 85 meters. So about 21 meters per decade downward shift in species lower elevation limits. So this was one of the more surprising finds, and some species driving this pattern were Gallium parishii, which is a little herbaceous species that grows at the higher elevations. Cylindropuntia ganderi as well has shifted downward substantially, as well as Encelia farinosa. And I'll point out that 2 of these are deciduous species, which ends up being a pattern here. And looking at elevational trends, so this is showing changes in the leading edge by their historic optimum elevation. And as you can see, the species that have shifted upward in their leading edge the most tend to be at the lower elevations. So species like Sorothamnus shodii, as well as Larea tridentata, which I'll point out are both evergreen species, have shifted upward quite substantially in their leading edge. So we found that specific leaf area, which is leaf area per dry mass, predicts these trailing edge dynamics, so these downward shifts, and not just in limits, which I'll show in a second, but also changing patterns in abundance. So this is showing that lower SLA species, or species on that more conservative end with smaller leaves that have a higher carbon content, have generally shifted or have generally decreased in their trailing edge abundance, and the opposite for higher SLA species. And one of the species that has decreased at their trailing edge that has a low SLA is Pinus monophylla, which also shifted upward quite a bit in its maximum elevation, as well as Ribes cerium on the opposite end of the spectrum. So Ribes has a high SLA and has increased in abundance at its trailing edge. So this is a pretty interesting find. And then looking at changes in the trailing edge limits. So higher SLA species have generally shifted downward in their lower elevation limits. So species like Gallium parishii also have a high SLA, as well as Ocotillo has a high SLA. I'll point out also both of these are deciduous species, and they both shifted their lower edge limit quite a bit, as well as Encelia. So this is looking at changes in optimum elevation, which is abundance weighted elevation. And as you can see, lower SLA species have also shifted upward in their patterns of abundance, while the opposite pattern, I'm finding this downward shift in abundance that I'm seeing for high SLA species. So 2 species that are strongly contributing to this are Yucca shadidra, and Yucca has a very low SLA, and it has shifted upward in its leading edge quite substantially, but also its abundance weighted elevation has shifted upward. And Sorothamnus shodii is another species that's contributing to this pattern. And what I was getting at earlier is that there's a significant pattern of, in this system, this is not the case in all ecosystems, but species with higher SLA do tend to be deciduous species, while the evergreen species tend to have lower SLA. And so looking at kind of overall patterns, I found that the change in the leading edge, so species shifting upward in their highest elevation limits, tended to decrease in their abundance at their trailing edge. So exhibiting this leaning shift that I was getting at earlier. So this was still the predominant mode of response from species, so consistent with what Anne found. And I also wanted to point out that 2 species that are most strongly contributing to this pattern is Yucca shadidra that's in this picture, as well as Pinus monophylla that's in this picture. This is a nonlinear model of average species cover at each elevation for each year. And this shows elevational differences in the average response of species given their historic optimum elevation. So it's showing that species with higher elevational optima tended to decrease in average cover since 1977, especially at the highest elevations. And the opposite pattern, we find an increase at lower elevations since 1977 on average. So the pattern that we found with increasing total perennial cover and average species cover at lower elevations is consistent with other studies of long-term vegetation change in the deserts of the Southwest. The differences in response among different elevations is also consistent with some other long-term studies of range shifts in which more pronounced changes occur at lower elevations. So this is likely due to differences in the prevailing environmental conditions and available habitats, including edaphic conditions, which is something I plan to get more into. Soil texture is really important for dryland species, so I plan to analyze soil texture and look at that as well. So the downward shifts that I'm finding are have also been, they're becoming increasingly common in these long-term studies. So of these studies that tend to report this less often, a quarter of species have shifted downward. And a recent study from the Mojave Desert reported that 41% of species that they documented shifted downslope in both their average and minimum elevation. So their trailing edge are also shifting downward. So it is consistent with what other people are finding. And speculating on potential mechanisms for this. So there's a longstanding hypothesis that the lower margins of species ranges are governed more by biotic interactions, particularly competitive interactions, and leading edges of species tend to be more limited by abiotic stress. And so because of this, the increasing prevalence of these downward shifts has been suggested to be due to some kind of competitive release. So what we could be seeing is the low SLA species that have shifted upward and generally declined at their trailing edge. There might be some competitive release going on for the higher SLA species to increase in their abundance. So SLA, specific leaf area, captures differences in life history strategies. And so far, it's the only trait that seems to be predictive of species long-term responses, which is surprising since SLA is often highly correlated with some of the other traits that I tested. So it reflects a trade-off in resource use and acquisition, with high SLA species having the ability to produce rapid biomass, having higher growth rates, and greater competitive abilities. So these acquisitive species, again, were found to decrease their lower elevation limits and increase their abundance at their lower elevation, while we found the opposite pattern for low SLA species that are generally shifting upward. There's another study from the Mojave that has found a similar pattern where low SLA species are declining with higher temperature and lower precipitation. And also thinking about life history trade-offs. So at the lower elevations, the high SLA species are drought deciduous, so they have the ability to drop their leaves in stressful summer drought conditions. They also tend to be more shallow rooted, so they could be taking more advantage of shallow soil moisture, whereas the deeper rooted low SLA species could be more dependent on deeper groundwater that's not being replenished. So this is something I'm gonna be thinking more about. One intriguing idea that I also plan to investigate further is the impact of asymmetric warming. So there's been this global trend of nighttime temperatures increasing at a faster rate than daytime temperatures, which is likely to have some diverse and pretty profound consequences for the natural world. And in particular for plants, rising minimum nighttime temperatures are expected to impact carbon assimilation and consumption, because most photosynthesis occurs during the daytime. and it's more sensitive to maximum daytime temperatures, while respiration occurs throughout the entire deal cycle. So it's influenced by nighttime minimum temperatures. Looking at the data from the regional weather stations, one of the most consistent patterns I'm finding, because there is a lot of variability, is an increase in nighttime temperatures. So the photosynthetic overcompensation is this concept that I'm looking into, where basically plant photosynthesis is stimulated by an increased drawdown of leaf carbohydrates at night. And I found a study that has, it's actually a meta-analysis that's finding support for a positive relationship of higher nighttime temperatures with higher SLA species, while CAM species are more negatively affected by higher nighttime temperatures. So this would explain the upward shift in the CAM species such as Yucca shadidra. So this is something I'm really intrigued by and I'm going to be studying a bit more. And accumulating research is showing that interactions with other plant species can actually be more important than changing climatic conditions in driving plant population dynamics under climate change. Climate change is causing a shift in the nature of species interactions. So sometimes facilitative interactions becoming more competitive or vice versa, as well as increasing the novel interactions among species that have never interacted before or haven't in a long time. So this can either hinder or enhance species response in abundance and their ability to shift in their range. So some species might be dependent on critical establishment phases that depend on facilitative shrub species. And they might lose their facilitator species and thus might not be able to track their optimum conditions. So positive species interactions, such as plant facilitation, has shown to increase the functional diversity in plant communities, and functional diversity could make more communities more resilient to others. So the next direction that I'm taking with this data, I'm actually more of a plant community ecologist, so I plan to put this into more of a community assembly framework to understand how biotic interaction networks among plant species might mediate their community level functional trait patterns over time. So this will be the focus of my second chapter. And I would love to acknowledge these fantastic people. So Ann Kelly has been extremely helpful. Chris Tracy and Mark at Deep Canyon Reserve are just incredibly kind humans that have helped me out so much. My lab mates and my PI are the absolute best. And I just had the best time in the field with the technicians that helped me. I would also love to acknowledge that, the Cahuilla have been stewards of this land for thousands of years. And most importantly, I would love to acknowledge the canyon itself, the plants and animals there, and all that it's taught me in this journey over the past couple of years. And with that, I would love to answer any of your guys' questions.
Thank you, Tessa. There is a question from Edith Allen. She wrote, irrigation has increased in the Coachella Valley. Could there be increases in relative humidity that affect your gradient?
I'm sorry, can you say that? Here, I think I need to stop sharing.
Irrigation has increased in the Coachella Valley. Could there be increases in relative humidity that affect your gradient?
Oh, interesting.
It's in the chat.
Thank you for that question, Edie. So first of all, I'm a fan of your work and I'm really excited that you're here. And that's a really insightful question because I've also been reading about how nighttime warming is enhanced by cloud cover, which is driven by humidity. So there could definitely be something there. I feel like I'm trying to learn a lot really quickly about climate and don't quite grasp it well enough to talk about it super clearly, but yeah, that's a really interesting idea.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have any better response for it, but it's definitely something that that I'd like to consider in that discussion on potential asymmetric warming impacts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do we have any other questions? Anyone? I don't see any more in the chat or any hands up, so if you do have a question and I'm just not seeing it, please go ahead and speak up. Okay, well, Tessa, that was beautiful. Thank you very much. You scared me quite a bit in the very beginning. I'm not sure that I'm not still scared by the end, but we hope you'll come back again sometime when you get some more answers that you're looking for and get some more of your research that you want to do done.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to come back and talk to you all. And I'm just going to drop my email, my school email here that you all can keep in case you end up having other questions or comments. Again, this data, I'm still kind of processing it and trying to make sense of everything. So I definitely appreciate your all's input. If you guys have any other ideas.
Very cool. Okay, thank you. Can you hit the off on your recording?
Yes.